the stars swallowed by thick, unrelenting clouds. My GPS had died hours ago, and the highway signs had become sparse, their lettering faded beyond recognition. The only thing keeping me company was the steady hum of my engine and the occasional rustle of wind through the skeletal trees lining the narrow road. I told myself it was just a detour, a shortcut to save time, but deep down I knew better. There was something wrong about this place. The trees pressed closer, their branches gnarled and reaching like fingers eager to clutch at my car. My headlights barely pierced the darkness, revealing only twisted roots and the occasional glint of something wet on the pavement. The road narrowed further, forcing me to slow down. My knuckles were white against the steering wheel, my breath shallow. I wasn't sure when the silence had grown so absolute. No crickets, no wind, just the sound of my own breathing and the distant ticking of the engine. Then I saw it, a shape in the distance standing in the middle of the road. At first I thought it was a deer, but as I got closer, the silhouette sharpened into something human. A woman. She stood motionless, her head tilted slightly, watching me. My foot hesitated over the brake, my instincts screaming at me to turn around, but there was nowhere to go. The road was too narrow and the forest too dense. I had no choice but to stop. As my car rolled to a halt, my headlights flooded her with light. She was barefoot, her dress a tattered, grayish-white, clinging to her thin frame. Her arms hung limply at her sides, her hair tangled and damp. Her face was obscured, hidden beneath a curtain of matted strands. I swallowed hard, my heart hammering against my ribs. I reached for the lock button, though I couldn't explain why. She hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. Just stood there as if waiting. I cracked my window just enough to call out, "Hey, are you okay?" My voice sounded strange, too loud in the oppressive silence. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she took a single step forward. The way she moved sent a shiver through me. It was slow, deliberate, almost unnatural. I resisted the urge to throw the car into reverse and slam my foot on the gas. She took another step, her bare feet silent on the pavement. Then, in a motion too quick for my eyes to follow, she was suddenly right next to my window. I jerked back with a gasp, my hand fumbling to roll up the window. She was close enough now that I could see her face through the gap. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, her lips cracked and dry. But it was her eyes that froze me in place. They were wrong. Too large, too black, voids where light was swallowed whole. A scream clawed its way up my throat, but my voice failed me. She raised a hand, placing her fingers lightly against the glass. They were ice cold even through the barrier. Then she smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. It stretched too far, her lips splitting at the corners as though something beneath her skin was forcing them apart. My breath came in sharp gasps as I fumbled to shift the car into gear. Her fingers dragged along the window, leaving behind smudges of something dark. What? I didn't wait to find out. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, the tires screeching against the pavement. The car lurched forward, but as I sped past, my side mirror caught one last glimpse of her. She was still standing in the middle of the road, smiling, her head tilting even further to one side, unnaturally far. Almost broken. The road twisted and turned in impossible ways. No matter how far I drove, the trees never thinned, the road never widened. It felt as though I was trapped in some kind of loop, going in circles but never actually circling back. My knuckles ached from gripping the wheel too tightly, my breaths coming in short, shallow bursts. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what had just happened, but there was no logical explanation. No normal explanation. Then the radio crackled. It had been dead for hours, nothing but static. But now, through the hissing and popping, a voice pushed through. A whisper, distorted and distant. My heart slammed against my chest as I turned the volume knob, trying to make out the words. The whisper grew clearer, a breath against my ear. "Don't stop." I nearly swerved off the road. The voice was soft, almost pleading, but it carried a weight that sent a sickening chill through me. My foot pressed harder on the accelerator. The speedometer climbed. The road seemed endless. No exits, no signs, just the same suffocating tunnel of trees. Then the headlights flickered. For a split second, everything went black. My stomach dropped and I slammed the brakes. The The car skidded, tires screeching, but as the lights came back on, my blood turned to ice. She was in front of me again. Not just standing this time, crawling. Her limbs bent at impossible angles, her fingers clawing at the pavement as she dragged herself forward. Her mouth hung open, lips stretched too wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Her eyes, those empty, endless pits, locked onto mine. A guttural, wet sound bubbled up from her throat, something between a laugh and a scream. My body refused to move, my hands frozen on the wheel. She surged forward. I reacted on instinct, yanking the wheel hard. The car swerved violently, tires catching the edge of the pavement. The world tilted, metal groaned, glass shattered. A deafening crash swallowed everything. Silence. When I opened my eyes, everything was upside down. The world swam in and out of focus. My head throbbed, the taste of copper thick on my tongue. I groaned, trying to move, but pain flared through my ribs. The car was wrecked, the windshield shattered, the frame twisted like a crushed can. And then I heard it. A soft tapping on the broken glass. Slow, rhythmic, deliberate. I turned my head, vision swimming. Through the splintered remains of my windshield, she was there, crouched low, her face inches from mine. Her mouth still stretched in that awful, unnatural grin. And her voice, barely a whisper, filled the car. You should have never stopped. Then the glass shattered completely and everything went dark. I woke up gasping for air. Cold, damp earth pressed against my back. The sky above was still shrouded in darkness, but something was different. The road was gone. The car was gone. And then I heard it, footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling me. I wasn't alone. A breath, cold as death, ghosted against my ear. And then a whisper, the same voice from the radio. Run. As I scrambled to my feet, my head spun, the dizziness threatening to pull me back down. The cold air bit at my skin, and every muscle in my body screamed in protest. But the voice had told me to run, and I wasn't about to ignore it. I took off, my feet barely finding purchase on the damp earth. The trees loomed overhead, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. The footsteps behind me quickened, a sickening contrast to the silence that swallowed the forest. Whatever was following me wasn't running, it was gliding, closing the distance without effort. My breath came in ragged gasps, my lungs burning. The ground sloped downward and I stumbled, barely catching myself before I went tumbling. The sensation of being watched prickled at my skin, crawling up my spine like icy fingers. I didn't dare look back. Then the whisper started again. Soft at first, like wind slipping through cracks in an old house. But they grew, twisting around me, slipping into my ears. They weren't words anymore, just distorted sounds, layered voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I pressed my hands against my ears, but they only grew louder, invading my mind, seeping into my thoughts. Then up ahead, a light. Faint, flickering, barely visible through the thick trees. But it was real. Something human. A chance. I forced my legs to move faster, sprinting toward it with everything I had left. As I got closer, I realized it was a cabin. Small, old, the wood rotted and the windows dark. But the light was coming from inside. I reached the door and pounded on it, my voice hoarse and desperate. Please, someone, help me. The whispers behind me stopped. Silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then the door creaked open. A single candle flickered inside, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. The air smelled of damp wood and something metallic. My heart pounded as I stepped in, glancing behind me one last time. The forest was empty. The door slammed shut. And then from the darkness, a voice, low, steady, and far too calm. You shouldn't have come here. The candle flickered and I saw them. A pair of eyes, black as the void, staring at me from the corner of the room. I took a step back, my breath hitching in my throat. The air inside the cabin was thick, suffocating, pressing against my chest like a lead weight. The flickering candle cast erratic shadows across the wooden walls, warping the shape of the figure standing in the corner. The eyes, black, bottomless voids, never blinked, never wavered, only stared. You shouldn't have come here, the voice repeated, softer this time, almost regretful. My back hit the door and I gripped the handle, ready to wrench it open and bolt. But when my fingers closed around the knob, it was ice cold, and no matter how hard I twisted, it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice barely more than a whisper. The figure stepped forward, and the candlelight illuminated his face. An old man, skin pale and stretched too tight over his bones as if he hadn't eaten in weeks. His lips were cracked, his breath shallow, but those eyes, they weren't human. "You should have kept driving," he murmured. "You stopped. You let her see you." My stomach dropped. Her? The image of the woman on the road flashed in my mind. The way she had moved. The way she had smiled. The old man nodded slowly. "She doesn't let go, not once she's marked you." I swallowed hard, shaking my head. No, I can leave. I'll leave right now." My hands fumbled with the lock, yanking, twisting. The door didn't move. The old man exhaled shakily. "It's too late. She's already inside." My blood turned to ice. A whisper, soft and breathy, brushed against my ear. "Found you." The candle went out. Darkness swallowed the room. I spun, my hands flailing in the pitch black. My heart pounded so loudly it drowned out everything else. A sharp creak echoed from the wooden floorboards. Then another. Footsteps. Coming closer. I stumbled backward, hitting the edge of a table, knocking something over. Glass shattered at my feet. The scent of something rotten filled the air, thick and cloying. My throat clenched while rising. The footsteps stopped. Silence. My skin prickled, every nerve on edge. Then, a hand. Ice-cold fingers brushing against my wrist. I screamed. I yanked away, stumbling, crashing into something solid. My hands met rough fabric, clothing. I wasn't alone. "Shoo." The old man's voice, barely a breath. "Don't move. She only sees what moves." My body locked up. My muscles ached to run, but I forced myself still. The air in the room shifted, growing impossibly heavy. A soft shuffle, then the sound of something dragging against the wooden floor. Slow, deliberate, then breathing. Right next to me. Shallow. Wet. Like something struggling to draw air into broken lungs. The old man's hand clamped onto my arm, fingers digging in. I felt him trembling. He was just as terrified as I was. Then I heard it. The sickening, skin-crawling sound of bones popping. Joints twisting in ways they shouldn't. A rasping whisper inches from my face. "Run." The old man shoved me. I didn't think, I bolted. My legs moved before my mind could catch up. I barreled forward, arms outstretched, blindly feeling for a way out. My shin collided with something, pain flaring up my leg, but I didn't stop. I kept moving, kept running. A deafening crash erupted behind me, followed by a high, shrill scream. It wasn't human. It was something else. Something wrong. Then I saw it, the faintest outline of a window. My only chance. I didn't hesitate. I threw myself at it. Glass shattered around me, slicing into my arms, my face. The cold night air hit me like a wall as I tumbled onto the damp earth outside. Pain flared through my body, but I pushed it down and scrambled to my feet. Behind me, inside the cabin, something moved. Slowly. Deliberately. A silhouette, tall and twisted, stepped into the broken frame of the window. The woman. Her mouth stretched into that same grotesque grin, her eyes endless voids. But now she wasn't just standing still. She was climbing. Crawling. Her limbs bent at unnatural angles as she slithered out of the cabin, her fingers clawing into the earth. I ran. The forest closed around me, branches tearing at my skin, roots threatening to trip me. The ground sloped downward, my feet slipping on the wet leaves. I could hear her behind me. Not running. Not walking. Just moving. Fast. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. I just had to get away. But the forest was changing. The trees twisted, their trunks warping. The path beneath me looped back on itself. My breath came in ragged gasps as I realized the horrifying truth. I was running in circles. A sound, low, guttural laughter, echoed through the trees. She was playing with me. My legs burned, my vision blurred, but I pushed on. Then up ahead, a light. Not the cabin. Something bigger. A house. I sprinted toward it, my last shred of hope. The windows glowed dimly and the porch light flickered. I didn't stop to question it. I crashed onto the porch, hammering on the door. "Help me." My voice was raw, desperate. "Please?" The door swung open. A man stood there, tall, unmoving, his face shrouded in shadow. I stumbled back, my instincts screaming. Then, as the porch light flickered one last time, I saw his eyes. Black, bottomless, just like hers. And then, the door slammed shut, and everything went dark. The darkness swallowed me whole, and for a moment I was nowhere. Just floating in an abyss, my breath echoing in my ears, my heartbeat hammering against my ribs. The forest, the house, the woman, gone. Had I died? Was this the end? My fingers trembled as I reached out, expecting to feel something solid, but the air was thick, heavy, almost like liquid. Then, slowly, like ink dissolving in water, the darkness shifted. Shapes emerged, blurred and indistinct at first, then sharpening into the familiar outline of trees. The forest. I was back in the damn forest. Panic surged through me as I turned, searching for the house, for anything that made sense. But the house wasn't there. Only endless trees stretching into the void, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. The air smelled of damp earth and something metallic, blood. My breath came in quick, shallow gasps as the realization set in. I was trapped. I had never escaped. She had never let me go. A whisper slithered through the trees, curling around my ears. "You can't run forever." I spun, my back slamming into a tree. The bark scraped against my palms, grounding me, reminding me I was still real, still alive. But for how long? My vision darted through the shifting shadows, searching, waiting. Then I saw her. Not fully, just glimpses. The slither of pale fingers curling around a tree trunk. The brief glint of blackened eyes peering from between the branches. She wasn't rushing anymore. She didn't need to. She was patient. She knew I had nowhere to go. I forced my breath to steady, my mind to focus. There had to be a way out. I had seen the road before, the one I had driven down before stopping at the cabin. If I could find it, maybe, just maybe, I could get back to my car. But which way? The forest had twisted around me, shifting its shape like a living thing. Every path looked the same. My muscles coiled with tension as I listened, trying to drown out the pounding of my own heartbeat. Then, in the distance, I heard it. A sound so faint it was almost imaginary. An engine. A car. The road. I took off, feet pounding against the damp earth. The branches clawed at my clothes, my skin, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but I pushed forward, following the distant hum of salvation. Closer. Closer. I could almost see it now, the faintest glimmer of headlights piercing through the trees. But then the sound stopped. Silence. The world seemed to exhale, holding its breath. And then, behind me, much too close, a single wet, rattling breath. I froze. My entire body seized as icy fingers brushed against the back of my neck. "Not yet," she whispered. I ran. I didn't care if I was running blindly, didn't care if I was going in the wrong direction. I just needed to move. My legs pumped harder than they ever had before, adrenaline surging through every vein. The trees blurred past me in a dizzying whirl. The sound of her movement was everywhere, an impossible, nightmarish rustling that seemed to come from all sides at once. But then I saw it. The road. The empty stretch of asphalt cutting through the forest like a lifeline. My car was still there, parked where I had left it. I didn't slow down. Didn't think. My hands fumbled in my pockets for the keys as I barreled toward the driver's side. My fingers shook violently as I yanked the door open and threw myself inside. The locks. I jammed them down, my breaths coming in ragged, frantic gasps. My hands fumbled with the key, trying to shove it into the ignition. My pulse pounded so hard I could barely see straight. Click. The engine roared to life. Relief flooded through me like a drug, but I didn't have time to feel it. My foot slammed onto the gas pedal, and the tires screeched against the pavement as the car lurched forward. The forest blurred past me, the trees whipping by in a dark frenzy. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I just drove as fast and as far as I could, until the forest was nothing but a distant nightmare in my rearview mirror. The town lights appeared ahead, glowing like a beacon of hope. My hands were still trembling as I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I didn't stop until I reached the first gas station I saw, its fluorescent lights buzzing like an electric hum of reality. My breaths came in short, uneven bursts as I threw the car into park and rested my forehead against the steering wheel. I was safe. I had made it. Or so I thought. The air inside the car was still. Too still. A chill crawled up my spine. And then, a soft, wet breath against my ear. You brought me with you. The scream tore from my throat as the world snapped into darkness. The darkness was suffocating. It wasn't just an absence of light. It was thick, tangible, pressing against my skin like a second layer of flesh. My breath came in short, sharp gasps as I sat frozen in the driver's seat, my mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. I had escaped. I had driven away. I had left that godforsaken forest behind. But the whisper in my ear, the wet breath against my skin, it was impossible. I was alone. I forced myself to move, to reach for the interior light switch. My fingers were stiff, trembling violently as I flicked it on. The dim yellow glow illuminated the inside of my car. Empty. The passenger seat was bare, the back seat undisturbed. My breathing slowed just a little. Maybe it was in my head. Maybe the exhaustion, the fear, had finally cracked something inside me. I needed to calm down. But then I saw it. The rearview mirror. At first, I didn't register what I was looking at. The reflection showed my own wide, terrified eyes, the shallow rise and fall of my chest. But just beyond that, in the back seat, something was wrong. The shadows weren't right. They seemed thicker, heavier, pooled unnaturally in the corner of the seat. I stared, unblinking, willing myself to see nothing. But the longer I looked, the clearer it became. The shape. No, someone. My heart stopped. She was sitting there. Not fully visible, not entirely solid, but she was there, watching me with those empty, blackened eyes. Her lips curled into a slow, knowing smile, and I could hear it again. Her voice crawling through the air like a snake. You can't leave me behind. I didn't think. My body acted on pure survival instinct. My hand shot out, slamming the car door open as I stumbled out onto the pavement. The gas station was empty, the only sounds the buzzing of fluorescent lights and the distant hum of crickets in the night. I spun back toward the car, my breath hitching in my throat. She was gone. The back seat was empty. The car was just a car. I wiped at my face, my skin damp with sweat. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But it felt real. Too real. My hands were still shaking as I backed away from the vehicle, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever the hell had just happened. I needed help. Someone, anyone. The gas station. I turned, my legs unsteady as I made my way toward the glass doors. The neon open sign flickered weakly, casting a dull red glow against the pavement. The inside was dimly lit, the shelves half-stocked with dusty snacks and old newspapers. A lone cashier sat behind the counter, a middle-aged man with graying hair and sunken eyes, flipping through a magazine with an air of complete disinterest. I stepped inside, the bell above the door chiming softly. He barely glanced up. Help you. My mouth was dry. What was I supposed to say? That I was being haunted? That something had followed me? I hesitated, my pulse still hammering. Do you have a phone I can use? The man exhaled through his nose, gesturing vaguely to the corner where a payphone sat covered in grime. It still works if you got quarters. I nodded quickly, fumbling through my pockets for change. My fingers found a few coins, slick with sweat, and I shoved them into the slot. I didn't even know who I was calling. The police? What would I even say? I hesitated for a second before dialing the only number that made sense. My brother. The phone rang once, twice, then clicked as a groggy voice answered. Hello? James? I breathed, my voice barely above a whisper. James, something's wrong. I don't know what's happening, but I need... Static. A low, droning hum crackled through the receiver, distorting the line. My skin prickled as the noise grew louder, warping into something else, something familiar. Breathing. Slow. What? Right into my ear. You can't run. I dropped the phone. My entire body seized with terror as I stumbled back, my breath hitching in my throat. The cashier barely glanced up. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely breathe. I turned on my heel and ran. The night air hit me like a slap, cold and suffocating. My car sat just a few feet away, the driver's side door still open, waiting. I hesitated. Could I even trust it anymore? Could I trust anything? Then, movement. From the corner of my eye, in the reflection of the gas station window, I saw her. Not standing. Not walking. Crawling. Her limbs twisted at unnatural angles, her mouth stretched into something that was almost a grin but not quite human. Her fingers scraped against the pavement as she dragged herself toward me, her body moving in sharp, jerky motions, like a broken marionette. I didn't think. I ran. Not toward the car. I couldn't trap myself again. Instead, I sprinted down the road, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. The town wasn't far. If I could just reach it, if I could just make it to someone. A sound. A horrible, gurgling laugh rising behind me. She was getting closer. I pushed harder, my muscles screaming as I bolted toward the distant glow of streetlights. My mind was a blur, my only thought survival. I reached the edge of town, my feet slamming against the pavement as I burst onto the main street. And then, everything stopped. The town was empty. The lights flickered, casting long, twisting shadows across the pavement. The storefronts were abandoned, the windows boarded up. The air was heavy, thick with silence. I turned in a slow circle, my pulse pounding against my skull. No cars. No people. No sound. Just me. And her. I didn't need to turn around to know she was there. You were never going to escape. Her voice was right against my ear. I closed my eyes. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I understood now. I had never left the forest. I had never left the house. I had never escaped her. I was hers. And I always had been. Story 2. The night was heavy with silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that suffocates, pressing down like an unseen weight. My car's headlights cut through the darkness as I drove along the desolate road, the trees on either side towering like silent sentinels. The air smelled of damp earth, thick with the scent of recent rain. I kept my grip tight on the wheel, my knuckles white, my breath slow and measured. I told myself that the unease creeping through my veins was just exhaustion, that the feeling of being watched was just my mind playing tricks on me. But I knew better. I had taken this road before many times. It was the quickest way home. A stretch of cracked asphalt winding through miles of dense forest, abandoned cabins, and forgotten places that no one spoke of anymore. My phone had lost signal 10 minutes ago, but I wasn't worried. I was almost there. Just a few more miles. Yet, with every passing second, the trees seemed to grow taller, the shadows darker, the air heavier. My gut tightened, a slow and sickening dread coiling deep inside me. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid. Then I saw it. A figure standing by the edge of the road. I barely had time to react. My foot slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the wet pavement. My heart pounded against my ribs as my car lurched to a stop, the headlights illuminating the figure. A woman, pale, motionless, dressed in a thin, tattered nightgown that clung to her body like wet paper. Her face was obscured by long, dark hair, her posture unnaturally rigid. The way she stood there, unmoving, unblinking, sent a cold spike of fear down my spine. I swallowed hard, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my fingers ached. I didn't want to get out. I didn't want to roll down the window. I just wanted to keep driving. But I couldn't. Something about her kept me frozen in place. Then she moved. Not like a normal person. Not like someone who had been standing too long in the cold. Her body twitched, her shoulders jerking unnaturally as if she were being pulled by invisible strings. And then, slowly, painfully, her head turned toward me. I didn't breathe. Her face was wrong. Her eyes were too wide, too dark, like gaping holes that swallowed the light. Her mouth was slightly open, lips cracked and dry. Her skin was stretched too tight over her bones, as if she hadn't eaten in weeks. Then she took a step forward. My breath caught in my throat. My instincts screamed at me to drive, to get out of there. But I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something else. She took another step, and then another. The air inside my car turned ice cold. My breath came out in short, panicked gasps. She was almost at the hood of my car now, her bare feet silent against the wet pavement. I could hear something, a sound just beneath the hum of my engine. A whisper, faint, crawling through the air like a spider on my skin. I couldn't move. Then she stopped, right in front of my car, and she smiled. My stomach lurched. It wasn't a human smile. It was too wide, too forced, stretching her lips in a way that made my skin crawl. And then, in a voice that barely belonged to this world, she spoke. "You shouldn't have stopped." A cold rush of terror shot through me. My foot slammed onto the gas pedal before I even realized what I was doing. The car lurched forward, the engine roaring to life. My headlights flickered, and for a brief, sickening moment, I saw her face distort, her mouth stretching impossibly wide, her eyes turning into empty pits. And then she was gone. I didn't look back. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely keep control of the wheel. The road blurred ahead, my vision tunneling as I sped through the endless stretch of trees. The fear clung to me like a second skin, my heart hammering so hard it hurt. I just needed to get home. I just needed to be somewhere safe. Then the radio turned on. Static. Loud. Hissing. I fumbled with the dial, my fingers numb and clumsy, but no matter what I did, it wouldn't stop. The static crackled, rising in pitch, distorting, shifting. And then, laughter. Soft. Wet. Right behind me. I couldn't breathe. My body locked up, every nerve in me screaming as I realized I wasn't alone. I gripped the wheel so tightly my nails dug into my palms. My mouth went dry. I didn't want to look. I knew deep in my bones that if I looked in the rearview mirror, I would see something I was never meant to see. But I looked anyway, and she was there, sitting in my backseat, smiling. Her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her dark, hollow eyes locked onto mine through the mirror. The corners of her lips were split, the grin widening, stretching impossibly far. My stomach twisted violently, my hands slick with sweat. The laughter grew louder. My foot slammed onto the gas pedal, the car lurching forward at breakneck speed. The trees blurred past, the road twisting and turning beneath me. The laughter didn't stop. It echoed inside my skull, crawling under my skin, filling my lungs until I thought I would drown in it. Then the car jerked. The wheel wrenched in my hands, twisting violently to the right. My tires screamed against the pavement as the car skidded out of control. The world spun, headlights flashing through the trees. I braced for impact, a guttural scream tearing from my throat as the car slammed into something. Then silence, darkness. The world was still. My head throbbed, my body aching from the force of the crash. I gasped for air, my fingers digging into the steering wheel. The windshield was cracked, spiderwebbed with fractures. I tasted blood. I was alive. Slowly, painfully, I turned my head. The forest stretched around me, the trees looming like silent watchers. The car's engine sputtered, the headlights flickering weakly. My heart pounded in my chest, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she was gone. I let out a shaky breath, my entire body trembling. I reached for my phone, praying for a signal, for anything. My fingers fumbled against the screen, the dim glow of the battery icon barely visible in the dark. Then, a sound. A whisper, close, right outside the shattered window. "You shouldn't have stopped." My blood turned to ice, and then, fingers, pale, bloodless, curling over the edge of the glass. I couldn't scream. I couldn't run. All I could do was watch, and wait. The cold fingers curled over the edge of the shattered window, pale and lifeless, their sharp nails scraping against the glass. My breath hitched in my throat, every muscle in my body locking up as I watched, frozen, unable to look away. The night was too quiet. No wind, no rustling of leaves, no distant hum of insects, just the slow, deliberate sound of fingernails dragging across the broken shards. I wanted to scream, to shove the door open and run into the woods, but I knew that whatever waited outside was faster than me, stronger than me, smarter than me. The air inside the car had turned unbearably heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. It pressed against my chest, squeezing my lungs, making each breath feel like I was drowning in something unseen. My mind raced, trying to grasp what was happening, trying to make sense of the impossible. Then, slowly, impossibly, she began to rise. At first, it was just her head. The long strands of wet, tangled hair slid over the broken glass as she lifted herself up. Her skin was waxy, stretched too tightly over her skull, as if she weren't made of flesh but something else entirely, something hollow. Her lips were torn at the corners, pulled into that unnatural, jagged grin that was too wide, too forced, too wrong. Her empty black eyes locked onto mine, unblinking, devoid of anything remotely human. I sucked in a sharp breath, my fingers gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. I wanted to move, to do something, but my body refused to listen. It was as if I had been rooted to the seat, my limbs heavy, useless. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out everything else. Then she spoke, not with words, not with sound, but with something deeper, something that bypassed my ears entirely and went straight into my head. A voice that didn't belong, whispering in a language I shouldn't have understood, yet somehow did. You brought me with you. The words slithered through my mind, wrapping around my thoughts like vines, choking out all reason, all sense. My head throbbed, my skull feeling like it was being pried open. The pain was unbearable, but I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. I couldn't do anything but listen. You stopped. You saw me. Now you are mine. A violent shiver ran through me. I forced my hand up, fingers trembling as I reached for the door handle. I didn't care where I was. I didn't care how dark the woods were. I just needed to get out. No. But as soon as my fingertips brushed the handle, the car lurched. Something yanked it sideways, as if an invisible force had gripped the entire vehicle and was dragging it off the road. The tires screeched against the wet pavement, the chassis groaning under the unnatural pressure. My stomach twisted violently as the world tilted, the headlights spinning wildly as the car was pulled toward the trees. Then darkness. The impact was jarring, a sickening crunch of metal and glass. My head slammed against the steering wheel, a blinding pain exploding behind my eyes. For a moment, everything blurred, the world fading in and out, shifting between consciousness and something far worse. When my vision finally cleared, I realized something horrifying. The car wasn't on the road anymore. It was deep in the forest, surrounded by trees. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the reflection in the shattered windshield. I was still in the driver's seat, still gripping the wheel, still gasping for breath. But the reflection wasn't me. It was her. Her black, empty eyes stared at me from inside the glass. Her mouth stretched into that horrible grin. The moment I saw it, I felt something shift inside me, something wrong. My fingers felt numb, my legs heavy. I tried to move, to scream, but my throat was locked, as if unseen hands were wrapped around it, squeezing just enough to silence me. The reflection moved. Not like a mirror image. Not like me. It moved on its own. Her lips twitched, parting slowly. And then, with an agonizing slowness, she reached out. I watched in horror as her hand pressed against the inside of the windshield. Inside. The glass rippled like water, her fingers sinking through as if the barrier between us was no longer solid. My breath caught in my chest. I tried to jerk back, but I couldn't. My body was a puppet, and she was the one pulling the strings. Her fingers brushed my skin. Pull. What? Wrong. A violent shudder tore through me, my vision going white-hot with pain. My mind was unraveling, splintering into pieces I couldn't hold together. The air around me thickened, pulsing, shifting. I wasn't in the car anymore. I wasn't anywhere. I was nowhere. And then all at once, I was her. I felt my lips curl into that unnatural smile. I felt my head tilt, felt my bones crack as I moved in ways no human should. My reflection, my real self, was trapped behind the glass now, staring back at me with wide, terrified eyes. I watched as he, the real me, tried to scream, tried to move, but he couldn't. Just like I couldn't. Not anymore. Because I was on the other side now. And I was smiling. And I was hungry. The car's engine sputtered. The headlights flickered once, twice. And then, the world went dark. The moment the world went dark, a sickening silence fell over everything. Not the kind of silence that comes with peace, but the kind that suffocates, that drowns, that wraps around your throat like unseen hands. I was nowhere, yet I was aware. Aware of the weightlessness, the absence of breath, the absence of a heartbeat. There was no up or down, no forward or backward. Just an endless void that felt alive, pulsing like a living thing. I tried to move, to scream, to do something, but there was no body to command, no mouth to form words, no air to push sound. I was just a presence, a thought trapped in darkness. Then something changed. A ripple in the void. A tremor that wasn't a sound but something deeper, something more primal. Like an ancient whisper vibrating through the abyss. And suddenly the darkness wasn't empty anymore. Shapes formed, vague and shifting, like smoke curling in water. At first, they were nothing but shadows stretching and twisting around me, faceless, unrecognizable. But then they became something else. Faces. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Thousands. Staring. Their eyes were hollow, deep pits of nothingness that stretched endlessly into the void. Their mouths gaped open, frozen in silent screams, their faces locked in expressions of terror. Some were familiar, too familiar. My father. My mother. Friends I hadn't seen in years. Strangers I had passed on the street. And then I saw myself, or what was left of me. The face was mine, but the eyes weren't. They were too dark, too wide, filled with something that didn't belong. Something ancient. Something that had never been human. The lips moved, but no sound came out. The mouth stretched wider, impossibly wide, until the jaw. Story 3. The wind howled through the trees like a wounded animal, its mournful cry echoing through the dense forest that surrounded my cabin. I had come here to escape, to find solace in the isolation, but now the silence felt oppressive, as if the very air was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the walls that seemed to dance and twist in ways that made my skin crawl. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the long nights and the endless expanse of wilderness were playing tricks on my mind. But deep down I knew better. Something was out there. Something had been watching me. It started with small things, things I could almost convince myself were normal. A branch snapping in the woods, the faint sound of footsteps on the porch when I knew no one was there. At first, I brushed it off as the natural sounds of the forest, the creaking of old wood settling in the cold. But then the noises grew louder, more deliberate. One night as I lay in bed, I heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from just outside my window. My heart pounded in my chest as I froze, straining to listen. The sound came again, closer this time, and I could swear I felt the vibration of it through the floorboards. I told myself it was an animal, a bear or a wolf, but the rational part of my mind knew that no animal I'd ever encountered sounded like that. It was too deep, too resonant, too human. The next morning I found the tracks. They were massive, far larger than any animal print I'd ever seen, and they circled the cabin before disappearing into the trees. The shape was wrong too. The toes were too long, the arch too pronounced, as if whatever made them walked on two legs but wasn't quite human. I tried to convince myself it was a hoax, that some kids from the nearby town were playing a cruel joke on me. But there was no town for miles, and the nearest neighbor was a recluse who hadn't been seen in years. I was alone out here, completely and utterly alone. That night the dreams started. Vivid, horrifying dreams of something stalking me through the woods, its eyes glowing like embers in the darkness. I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, only to hear the same low growl from outside my window. It was always there, just beyond the edge of the trees, watching and waiting. I began to dread the nights, to fear the moment the sun would dip below the horizon and the shadows would stretch long and dark across the forest floor. I started sleeping with a knife under my pillow, though I knew it would do little good against whatever was out there. One evening, as I sat by the fire trying to shake the chill that had settled deep in my bones, I heard it, a knock at the door. 3 sharp raps, deliberate and unhurried. My blood turned to ice. No one knew I was here. No one should be out here. I sat frozen, my breath caught in my throat as the knock came again, louder this time. The sound echoed through the cabin, reverberating in my chest like a drumbeat. I wanted to call out, to ask who was there, but my voice caught in my throat. The silence that followed was worse than the knocking. It stretched on for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. And then the doorknob began to turn. I leapt to my feet, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The door creaked open slowly, inch by inch, revealing nothing but the inky blackness of the night beyond. The cold air rushed in, extinguishing the fire in an instant and plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for the knife under my pillow, my hands trembling so badly I could barely grip it. The door swung open fully, and I could see the outline of something standing there, silhouetted against the night. It was tall, too tall, its limbs unnaturally long and twisted. Its eyes glowed faintly, two pinpricks of light that seemed to bore into my very soul. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a fear so primal it felt like it had been etched into my DNA. The thing stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, and I could hear the sound of its breath, a wet, rattling noise that made my stomach churn. It tilted its head, studying me, and I realized with a sickening certainty that it wasn't just an animal. It was intelligent. It was toying with me. The knife slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor, and the sound seemed to snap me out of my trance. I turned and ran, bolting for the back door, but it was already there, its grotesque form blocking my escape. I could feel its breath on my neck, hot and rancid, as it leaned in close. Its voice, when it spoke, was a guttural rasp that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You can't run," it said, the words slithering into my ears like poison. "You can't hide." I woke up screaming, my sheets tangled around me, the knife still clutched in my hand. The fire was still burning in the hearth, and the door was closed and locked. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe it had all been a dream, a horrible, vivid nightmare. But then I saw them, the footprints. They were there, just inside the door, wet and glistening in the firelight. And they led straight to my bed. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. The thing is out there watching, waiting. It's only a matter of time before it comes back. But where can I go? The nearest town is miles away, and the roads are treacherous this time of year. Even if I could make it, I'm not sure it would matter. The thing in the woods, it's not just a predator. It's a hunter, and I'm its prey. The sun is rising now, casting long golden rays through the trees. But the light brings no comfort. I can feel it out there, just beyond the edge of the forest, its eyes fixed on me. It's only a matter of time before it comes for me again. And when it does, I'm not sure I'll be able to fight it off. But I have to try. I have to survive. Because if I don't, I'll become just another story, another cautionary tale whispered around campfires. And the thing in the woods will keep hunting, keep feeding, until there's no one left to tell the tale. But maybe there's a way to fight back. Maybe there's something in the old books I brought with me, some piece of folklore or legend that can help me. I don't know. All I know is that I can't give up. Not yet. Not while there's still a chance. The thing in the woods may be strong, but so am I. And I'll be damned if I let it take me without a fight. The day is fading now, the shadows growing longer and darker. I can hear it out there, moving through the trees, its breath coming in ragged gasps. It's closer tonight. Closer than it's ever been. I don't know how much time I have left, but I know I have to act fast. The fire is burning low and the cold is creeping in. I can feel it in my bones, a deep, unshakable chill that has nothing to do with the temperature. It's the chill of fear, of dread, of knowing that something is coming for me. But I'm not going down without a fight. I've barricaded the doors and windows, set traps around the perimeter of the cabin. I've armed myself with everything I can find, knives, axes, even a rusty old shotgun I found in the basement. It's not much, but it's all I have. And if the thing in the woods wants me, it's going to have to work for it. The wind is picking up again, howling through the trees like a banshee. The fire is almost out, and the shadows are closing in. I can hear it now, just outside the door, its breath coming in short, ragged gasps. It's here. And it's not alone. I grip the knife tighter, my knuckles white, and brace myself for what's coming. The door creaks open, and the thing steps inside, its eyes glowing like coals in the darkness. It's bigger than I remember, its limbs longer, its movements more fluid. It's not just a predator anymore. It's something else. Something worse. But I'm ready. I have to be. Because if I'm not, then this is the end. And I'm not ready for it to end. Not yet. Not like this. The thing lunges and I swing the knife with all my strength. The blade connects, sinking deep into its flesh, and it lets out a roar that shakes the very foundations of the cabin. But it's not enough. It's never enough. The thing keeps coming, its eyes burning with a hatred so pure it makes my blood run cold. I swing again and again, but it's no use. The thing is too strong, too fast, too something. And then, just as I'm about to give up, just as I'm about to let the darkness take me, I see it, a glimmer of light, faint but steady, coming from the corner of the room. It's small, barely more than a spark, but it's there. And it's growing. The thing sees it too, and for the first time I see something like fear in its eyes. It hesitates, its massive form wavering, and I seize the opportunity. I lunge forward, driving the knife deep into its chest, and this time, it lets out a scream that shakes the very earth. The light grows brighter, filling the room with a warmth that drives back the cold, and the thing stumbles back, its form dissolving into shadow. And then just like that, it's gone. I collapse to the floor, my body trembling with exhaustion, and the light fades, leaving me in darkness once more. But it's a different kind of darkness now, a darkness that feels almost peaceful, almost safe. I don't know what happened or how I managed to drive the thing away, but I know one thing for certain. It's not over. Not yet. The thing in the woods is still out there, waiting, watching. And it's not going to stop until it gets what it wants. But neither am I. I'll fight it no matter what it takes. Because if I don't, then I'm as good as dead. And I'm not ready to die. Not yet. Not like this. The cabin was silent now, save for the faint crackling of the dying fire and the sound of my own labored breathing. My hands were still trembling, the knife clutched tightly in my grip, its blade slick with something dark and viscous that I didn't want to think too hard about. The thing was gone, for now, but the air still felt heavy, charged with an energy that made my skin prickle. I could feel its presence lingering, like a foul odor that refused to dissipate. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I dragged myself to my feet, my legs shaky and unsteady, and stumbled toward the window. The forest outside was eerily still, the trees standing like silent sentinels in the pale moonlight. But I knew better than to trust the stillness. The thing was out there, somewhere biding its time. It had tasted my fear and it would be back. I could feel it in my bones, a deep, unshakable certainty that made my stomach churn. I needed to prepare. The barricades I'd hastily thrown together earlier had held, but barely. The door was splintered, the hinges hanging loose, and the windows were cracked from the force of the thing's assault. I couldn't stay here. Not like this. But where could I go? The nearest town was miles away, and the roads were treacherous, especially at night. Even if I managed to make it to my car, there was no guarantee I'd be safe. The thing had found me here in the middle of nowhere. What was to stop it from following me? I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of fear that clouded my thoughts. I couldn't afford to panic. Not now. I needed to think, to plan. My eyes fell on the stack of old books I'd brought with me, their spines cracked and weathered with age. I'd picked them up at a flea market on a whim, drawn to their strange titles and faded covers. At the time, I thought they were just curiosities, relics of a bygone era. But now, as I stared at them, a spark of hope flickered in my chest. Maybe, just maybe, they held the answers I needed. I grabbed the top book, its cover embossed with strange, swirling symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the firelight. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but I could still make out the words. It was a collection of local folklore, stories passed down through generations about the creatures that lurked in the woods. I skimmed through the pages, my heart pounding as I searched for anything that might help me. And then I found it, a passage about a creature known as the Wendigo. The description sent a chill down my spine. The Wendigo was a malevolent spirit, born from greed and desperation, that preyed on the weak and the isolated. It was said to be tall and emaciated, with elongated limbs and glowing eyes, and it possessed an insatiable hunger for human flesh. The more I read, the more certain I became. This was the thing that had been stalking me. This was what I was up against. But the book didn't just describe the creature. It also offered a way to fight it. According to the legend, the Wendigo could be driven away with fire and silver, its weakness rooted in the elements that symbolized purity and light. I glanced at the fireplace, the embers still glowing faintly, and then at the old silver locket I wore around my neck. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I spent the next few hours fortifying the cabin as best I could, using every scrap of wood and metal I could find to reinforce the doors and windows. I fashioned crude torches from old rags and sticks, soaking them in lamp oil to ensure they would burn bright and hot. And I gathered every piece of silver I could find, a set of antique spoons, a candlestick, even the locket around my neck, and placed them strategically around the cabin, hoping they would provide some measure of protection. By the time I was done, the first light of dawn was creeping over the horizon, casting a pale, sickly glow over the forest. I was exhausted, my body aching from the effort, but I couldn't rest. Not yet. The thing was still out there, and I knew it would be back. I had to be ready. As the day wore on, I tried to keep myself busy, to distract myself from the gnawing fear that lurked at the edges of my mind. I checked the barricades, sharpened the knives, and practiced swinging the axe I'd found in the basement. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was as if the thing was always there, just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. By nightfall, I was a nervous wreck, my hands trembling as I lit the torches and placed them around the cabin. The firelight cast flickering shadows on the walls, and I couldn't help but feel like they were moving on their own, twisting and writhing in ways that made my skin crawl. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. The thing was close. I could feel it. And then, just as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the trees, I heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My heart leapt into my throat, and I gripped the axe tightly, my knuckles white. The growl came again, louder this time, and I could feel the vibration of it through the floorboards. It was here. I moved to the window, peering out into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. The forest was a wall of black, impenetrable and endless. And then, slowly I began to see them, the eyes. Glowing like embers in the darkness, they stared at me with a hatred so pure it made my blood run cold. There were more of them now, dozens of pairs, all fixed on me. The thing wasn't alone. Panic surged through me and I stumbled back from the window, my mind racing. What was I supposed to do? How could I fight so many of them? The book hadn't said anything about this. I was outnumbered, outmatched, and completely alone. But then, just as the first of the creatures began to emerge from the trees, I remembered something. A passage I'd skimmed over earlier, about the Wendigo's weakness to fire. If I could create a barrier of flames, maybe I could hold them off. It was a long shot, but it was all I had. I grabbed one of the torches and hurled it out the window, watching as it landed in the dry underbrush. The flames caught quickly, spreading through the forest with a speed that surprised even me. The creatures hesitated, their glowing eyes flickering with something like fear, and I seized the opportunity. I lit another torch and threw it, and then another, until the entire perimeter of the cabin was surrounded by a wall of fire. The creatures howled in rage, their voices blending together into a cacophony of sound that made my ears ring. They circled the flames, their movements jerky and unnatural, but they didn't dare cross the barrier. For now, at least, I was safe. But I knew it wouldn't last. The fire would burn itself out eventually, and when it did, the creatures would be waiting. I had to find a way to escape, to get out of here before it was too late. But how? The forest was vast and unforgiving, and I had no idea where to go. The nearest town was miles away, and even if I managed to make it there was no guarantee I'd be safe. The creatures had found me here in the middle of nowhere. What was to stop them from following me? I sank to the floor, my back against the wall, and buried my face in my hands. I was trapped, with no way out and no one to help me. The creatures were out there, waiting, and I was running out of time. But then, as I sat there in the darkness, a thought occurred to me. The book had mentioned something about the Wendigo's lair, a place deep in the forest where it was said to dwell. If I could find it, if I could destroy it, maybe I could end this nightmare once and for all. It was a desperate plan, born of desperation and fear, but it was all I had. I didn't know if it would work or if I'd even survive the attempt, but I had to try. I couldn't stay here waiting for the creatures to break through the flames. I had to take the fight to them. I grabbed the axe and a handful of torches, my hands trembling as I lit them. The flames cast flickering shadows on the walls, and I couldn't help but feel like they were watching me, judging me. But I pushed the thought aside and moved to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come, and then I stepped outside. The heat from the flames was intense, the air thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burning wood. The creatures were still there, circling the fire, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. They turned to face me as I emerged, their movements slow and deliberate, and I could feel the weight of their gaze like a physical force. But I didn't hesitate. I couldn't. I swung the axe with all my strength, the blade biting deep into the flesh of the nearest creature. It let out a howl of pain, its body writhing as it collapsed to the ground, and I didn't wait to see if it was dead. I moved to the next one, and the next, my movements fueled by a desperate primal need to survive. The creatures were fast, their claws slashing through the air with deadly precision, but I was faster. I dodged and weaved, my body moving on instinct, and I struck with a ferocity that surprised even me. The torches in my hand burned bright, their flames driving the creatures back, and I used them to my advantage, thrusting them into the faces of any that got too close. But there were too many of them. No matter how many I struck down, more seemed to take their place, their numbers endless. My arms were growing tired, my movements sluggish, and I knew I couldn't keep this up much longer. I had to find the lair, and fast. I broke into a run, my legs pumping as I sprinted through the forest, the creatures hot on my heels. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting and gnarled, and the ground was uneven, littered with roots and rocks that threatened to trip me with every step. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. And then, just as I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw it. A cave, its entrance hidden by a tangle of vines and moss. The air around it was thick with a foul, rotting smell, and I could feel the malevolence radiating from it like a physical force. This was it. The lair. I didn't hesitate. I plunged into the cave, the darkness swallowing me whole, and I lit one of the torches, the flame casting flickering shadows on the walls. The cave was narrow and winding, the walls slick with moisture, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. I could hear the creatures behind me, their howls echoing through the tunnel, but I didn't look back. I kept moving deeper and deeper into the darkness. And then, finally, I reached it, the heart of the lair. The chamber was vast, its ceiling lost in shadow, and the walls were lined with bones, their surfaces polished to a sickly sheen. In the center of the room stood a massive, grotesque figure, its body twisted and malformed, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The Wendigo. It turned to face me, its movements slow and deliberate, and I could feel the weight of its gaze like a physical force. It was taller than I remembered, its limbs longer and more twisted, and its mouth was filled with rows of jagged yellowed teeth. It let out a low, guttural growl, the sound reverberating through the chamber, and I knew I was outmatched. But I didn't care. I was done running. I was done being afraid. I gripped the axe tightly, my hands trembling, and I charged. And then, just as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the trees, I heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My heart leapt into my throat, and I gripped the axe tightly, my knuckles white. The growl came again, louder this time, and I could feel the vibration of it through the floorboards. It was here. I moved to the window, peering out into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. The forest was a wall of black, impenetrable and endless. And then, slowly I began to see them, the eyes. Glowing like embers in the darkness, they stared at me with a hatred so pure it made my blood run cold. There were more of them now, dozens of pairs, all fixed on me. The thing wasn't alone. Panic surged through me and I stumbled back from the window, my mind racing. What was I supposed to do? How could I fight so many of them? The book hadn't said anything about this. I was outnumbered, outmatched, and completely alone. But then, just as the first of the creatures began to emerge from the trees, I remembered something. A passage I'd skimmed over earlier, about the Wendigo's weakness to fire. If I could create a barrier of flames, maybe I could hold them off. It was a long shot, but it was all I had. I grabbed one of the torches and hurled it out the window, watching as it landed in the dry underbrush. The flames caught quickly, spreading through the forest with a speed that surprised even me. The creatures hesitated, their glowing eyes flickering with something like fear, and I seized the opportunity. I lit another torch and threw it, and then another, until the entire perimeter of the cabin was surrounded by a wall of fire. The creatures howled in rage, their voices blending together into a cacophony of sound that made my ears ring. They circled the flames, their movements jerky and unnatural, but they didn't dare cross the barrier. For now, at least, I was safe. But I knew it wouldn't last. The fire would burn itself out eventually, and when it did, the creatures would be waiting. I had to find a way to escape, to get out of here before it was too late. But how? The forest was vast and unforgiving, and I had no idea where to go. The nearest town was miles away, and even if I managed to make it there was no guarantee I'd be safe. The creatures had found me here in the middle of nowhere. What was to stop them from following me? I sank to the floor, my back against the wall, and buried my face in my hands. I was trapped, with no way out and no one to help me. The creatures were out there, waiting, and I was running out of time. But then, as I sat there in the darkness, a thought occurred to me. The book had mentioned something about the Wendigo's lair, a place deep in the forest where it was said to dwell. If I could find it, if I could destroy it, maybe I could end this nightmare once and for all. It was a desperate plan, born of desperation and fear, but it was all I had. I didn't know if it would work or if I'd even survive the attempt, but I had to try. I couldn't stay here, waiting for the creatures to break through the flames. I had to take the fight to them. I grabbed the axe and a handful of torches, my hands trembling as I lit them. The flames cast flickering shadows on the walls, and I couldn't help but feel like they were watching me, judging me. But I pushed the thought aside and moved to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come, and then I stepped outside. The heat from the flames was intense, the air thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burning wood. The creatures were still there, circling the fire, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. They turned to face me as I emerged, their movements slow and deliberate, and I could feel the weight of their gaze like a physical force. But I didn't hesitate. I couldn't. I swung the axe with all my strength, the blade biting deep into the flesh of the nearest creature. It let out a howl of pain, its body writhing as it collapsed to the ground, and I didn't wait to see if it was dead. I moved to the next one, and the next, my movements fueled by a desperate primal need to survive. The creatures were fast, their claws slashing through the air with deadly precision, but I was faster. I dodged and weaved, my body moving on instinct, and I struck with a ferocity that surprised even me. The torches in my hand burned bright, their flames driving the creatures back, and I used them to my advantage, thrusting them into the faces of any that got too close. But there were too many of them. No matter how many I struck down, more seemed to take their place, their numbers endless. My arms were growing tired, my movements sluggish, and I knew I couldn't keep this up much longer. I had to find the lair, and fast. I broke into a run, my legs pumping as I sprinted through the forest, the creatures hot on my heels. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting and gnarled, and the ground was uneven, littered with roots and rocks that threatened to trip me with every step. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. And then, just as I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw it. A cave, its entrance hidden by a tangle of vines and moss. The air around it was thick with a foul, rotting smell, and I could feel the malevolence radiating from it like a physical force. This was it, the lair. I didn't hesitate. I plunged into the cave, the darkness swallowing me whole, and I lit one of the torches, the flame casting flickering shadows on the walls. The cave was narrow and winding, the walls slick with moisture, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. I could hear the creatures behind me, their howls echoing through the tunnel, but I didn't look back. I kept moving deeper and deeper into the darkness, and then, finally, I reached it, the heart of the lair. The chamber was vast, its ceiling lost in shadow, and the walls were lined with bones, their surfaces polished to a sickly sheen. In the center of the room stood a massive, grotesque figure, its body twisted and malformed, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The Wendigo. It turned to face me, its movements slow and deliberate, and I could feel the weight of its gaze like a physical force. It was taller than I remembered, its limbs longer and more twisted, and its mouth was filled with rows of jagged yellowed teeth. It let out a low, guttural growl, the sound reverberating through the chamber, and I knew I was outmatched. But I didn't care. I was done running. I was done being afraid. I gripped the axe tightly, my hands trembling, and I charged. The Wendigo moved faster than I expected, its claws slashing through the air with deadly precision, but I dodged, my body moving on instinct. I swung the axe, the blade biting deep into its flesh, and it let out a roar of pain, its body writhing as it stumbled back. But it wasn't enough. The wound healed almost instantly, the flesh knitting itself back together before my eyes, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I couldn't kill it. Not like this. But I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. I remembered the book, the passage about the Wendigo's weakness to fire. If I could trap it, if I could burn it, maybe I could destroy it. I grabbed one of the torches and hurled it at the creature, the flames catching on its oily flesh. It let out a howl of rage, its body writhing as the fire spread, and I seized the opportunity. I lit another torch and threw it, and then another, until the entire chamber was filled with flames. The Wendigo thrashed and roared, its body consumed by the fire, and I watched as its form began to dissolve, the flesh melting away to reveal the bones beneath. And then, finally, it collapsed, its body crumbling to ash as the flames consumed it. I sank to the floor, my body trembling with exhaustion, and I watched as the fire burned itself out, leaving the chamber in darkness once more. The creatures were gone, their howls silenced, and I knew it was over. The Wendigo was dead. But as I sat there in the darkness, a strange feeling came over me. It was a cold, creeping sensation like ice spreading through my veins, and I realized with a sinking feeling that it wasn't over. Not really. The Wendigo was gone, but its presence lingered, a malevolent force that had taken root deep within me. I didn't know what it meant or what would happen next, but I knew one thing for certain. I would never be the same again. The forest had claimed me just as it had claimed so many others before me, and there was no escape. Not really. But I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. I would fight no matter what it took. Because if I didn't, then I was as good as dead. And I wasn't ready to die. Not yet. Not like this. The silence in the cave was deafening, broken only by the faint crackling of dying embers and the sound of my own ragged breathing. My body felt heavy, as if the weight of the world had settled on my shoulders, and my mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. The Wendigo was gone, reduced to ash and bone, but the victory felt hollow. The cold sensation that had taken root in my chest was spreading, a slow, insidious creep that made my skin crawl. I could feel it, something dark and malevolent, something that didn't belong. It was as if the Wendigo's essence had seeped into me, a parasite burrowing deep into my soul. I stumbled to my feet, my legs trembling beneath me, and made my way out of the cave. The forest outside was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of nocturnal creatures absent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, as if the world itself was waiting to see what would happen next. The wall of fire I had created around the cabin had burned down to smoldering embers, and the creatures that had been circling it were gone. Whether they had fled or been destroyed along with the Wendigo, I couldn't say. All I knew was that the immediate threat was over, for now. But the deeper threat remained. The cold inside me was growing stronger, a constant reminder that the Wendigo's influence hadn't been completely eradicated. I could feel it whispering to me in the back of my mind, a voice that was both foreign and familiar, urging me to give in, to let it take control. I shook my head, trying to clear the thoughts, but they persisted, a relentless undercurrent that I couldn't ignore. I returned to the cabin, my movements slow and deliberate, as if I were walking through a dream. The place was a mess, shattered windows, splintered wood, and the acrid smell of smoke lingering in the air. But it was still standing, and for now that was enough. I collapsed onto the floor, my back against the wall, and stared at the remnants of the fire in the hearth. The flames had died down to glowing embers, their warmth barely enough to ward off the chill that had settled deep in my bones. I didn't know what to do next. The book had given me the tools to fight the Wendigo, but it hadn't prepared me for this. for the aftermath, for the lingering presence that refused to let go. I needed answers, but I had no idea where to find them. The nearest town was miles away, and even if I managed to make it there, I wasn't sure I could trust anyone with the truth. They would think I was crazy, and maybe I was. Maybe this was all just a figment of my imagination, a desperate attempt to make sense of the horrors I had experienced. But deep down I knew better. This was real. The cold, the whispers, the feeling of being watched. It was all real. And if I didn't find a way to rid myself of it, I wasn't sure I would survive. I spent the next few days in a haze, my mind consumed by the constant battle against the voice in my head. It was subtle at first, a faint whisper that I could almost ignore. But as time went on, it grew louder, more insistent, until it was all I could hear. It spoke of power, of strength, of the things I could achieve if I just let go. It promised me freedom from fear, from pain, from the constant struggle to survive. And part of me wanted to believe it. Part of me wanted to give in. But I couldn't. Not yet. Not while there was still a chance to fight back. I turned to the books again, desperate for answers. I pored over every page, every passage, searching for something, anything, that could help me. And then I found it. A single sentence, almost hidden among the dense text, that mentioned a ritual, a way to cleanse oneself of the Wendigos influence. It was vague, with no clear instructions, but it was enough to give me hope. The ritual required 3 things: a silver blade, a fire fueled by sacred wood, and a willing sacrifice. The first 2 were easy enough. I had the silver locket and the remnants of the fire in the hearth. But the third was more complicated. The sacrifice had to be something of great personal value, something that would sever the connection between the Wendigo and its host. It could be an object, a memory, or even a part of oneself. But whatever it was, it had to be given willingly, with no hesitation. I didn't know what to choose. My mind raced through the possibilities, each one more daunting than the last. I thought of the locket, the last gift from my mother before she passed away. It was precious to me, a symbol of the love and strength she had given me. But was it enough? Would it be enough to sever the connection? I didn't know, but I had to try. I gathered the items I needed: the silver locket, a piece of wood from the sacred tree mentioned in the book, and a small knife. I placed them in the center of the room, arranging them carefully, and then I knelt before them, my hands trembling as I prepared to begin the ritual. The first step was to light the fire. I placed the piece of wood in the hearth, along with some kindling, and struck a match. The flames caught quickly, their light casting flickering shadows on the walls. I watched as they grew, their heat warming the room, and then I turned my attention to the locket. I held it in my hands, feeling the cool metal against my skin, and closed my eyes. I thought of my mother, of the love and strength she had given me, and I whispered a silent prayer. Then, with a deep breath, I placed the locket in the fire. The flames roared to life, their light growing brighter, and I could feel the heat radiating from them. The locket began to melt, the silver pooling in the bottom of the hearth, and I felt a pang of loss. But I pushed it aside, focusing on the task at hand. The next step was the sacrifice. I picked up the knife, its blade glinting in the firelight, and held it to my palm. The voice in my head grew louder, urging me to stop, to reconsider, but I ignored it. I pressed the blade into my skin, feeling the sharp sting as it broke the surface, and watched as the blood welled up, dark and thick. I let the blood drip into the fire, each drop sizzling as it hit the flames, and I felt a surge of energy course through me. The fire grew brighter, its light almost blinding, and I could feel the cold inside me receding, the whispers growing fainter. It was working. But then, just as I thought it was over, the flames roared to life, their light growing brighter, and I felt a surge of energy course through me. The fire grew brighter, its light almost blinding, and I could feel the cold inside me receding, the whispers growing fainter. It was working. Story 4. I never believed in ghosts, not until I moved into that house. It stood at the edge of town, a Victorian monstrosity with peeling paint and sagging gutters. The real estate agent had called it a fixer-upper with character. I should have known better. But the price was too good, and I needed a fresh start. A new beginning after everything I had been through. I convinced myself that the creaking floors and the odd drafts were just signs of an old house settling. But as the days passed, the unsettling feeling in my gut only grew stronger. The first night was uneventful. The second night, however, was when it started. I woke to the sound of whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind slipping through the cracks in the window pane. But then I realized the whispers had cadence, rhythm, a hushed conversation happening just beyond my comprehension. I sat up in bed, holding my breath, straining to hear. The whispers stopped. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me in the silence of the night. I tried to sleep, but the feeling of being watched made it impossible. My body was tense, my ears attuned to every small creak, every shifting shadow. By the fourth night, I could no longer ignore what was happening. The whispers had grown louder, more insistent. And worse, they were no longer confined to the night. I would hear them when I walked down the hall, when I washed dishes, when I sat in my living room trying to read. Low murmurs just at the edge of my perception, growing louder the moment I tried to ignore them. My reflection in the bathroom mirror seemed off, as if it was watching me with just a little too much intent. I told myself it was paranoia, a product of exhaustion and stress. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Then came the scratching. At first, it was faint, a barely audible sound coming from the walls. I thought it was mice. The house was old, after all, and an infestation wouldn't have been surprising. But the scratching wasn't random. It moved, following me from room to room. Sometimes it would stop when I turned to listen, only to start again when I looked away. I set traps, checked for holes, nothing. Yet the scratching persisted, growing more aggressive, more urgent. And then one night, I woke up to find deep gouges in the wood beside my bed, as if something had clawed its way out from inside the wall. I began to dread the nights. I started leaving all the lights on, playing music just to drown out the whispers. But they didn't care. They spoke over the noise, louder, clearer, calling my name. My name. The first time I heard it, I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. They knew me. They were speaking to me. I couldn't understand the words, but I could feel the intent behind them. Hungry, desperate, eager. I tried to leave the house one night, but the moment I stepped outside, an overwhelming dizziness overtook me. The world spun and I collapsed onto the porch. When I woke up, I was back in bed, the covers tucked around me as if I had never moved. My shoes, however, were still damp with evening dew. The days blurred together after that. I stopped eating, stopped sleeping. I felt weak, drained, as if something was feeding on me. The air in the house grew heavy, thick with an oppressive darkness that followed me from room to room. Shadows clung to corners where they shouldn't have been. They flickered in my peripheral vision, moving when they thought I wasn't looking. I started seeing things. Figures standing at the end of the hall, shapes crouched in the corners of my room, eyes glinting in the darkness. I tried to convince myself they weren't real, but the moment I blinked, they were closer. One night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, too afraid to sleep, I felt something press against the mattress beside me. A weight heavy and undeniable. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The air grew cold and a rancid smell filled my nostrils, something rotting, festering. A hand brushed against my arm. A whisper right in my ear. Mine. I don't remember how I got out of bed, only that I ran. I ran through the house, down the stairs, yanking open the front door. But the darkness outside was suffocating, absolute. No stars, no moon. Just an endless void. I hesitated, and in that moment I felt fingers curl around my ankle, yanking me backward. I fell, my head slamming against the wooden floor. Everything went black. When I woke up, it was morning. The sun streamed through the windows as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. My ankle throbbed where the fingers had gripped me, dark bruises forming in the shape of a hand. I wanted to leave. I needed to leave. But something in me whispered that it wouldn't be that simple. The house wouldn't let me go. I could feel it watching, waiting. It had been patient this long. It could wait a little longer. And then I heard it. The whisper right behind me. A single word, spoken with chilling certainty. Stay. That night I refused to sleep. I sat in the middle of my bed, every light in the house turned on, but no matter how bright it was, the shadows still gathered at the edges of my vision. I felt it, the house, breathing around me, its walls expanding and contracting as though it were alive. The whispers hadn't stopped. They had grown more insistent, slithering through my thoughts like tendrils of smoke. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, dark figures, faceless but watching, waiting. I tried calling someone, anyone, but my phone was useless. No signal, no Wi-Fi, just a low static hum whenever I pressed it to my ear. It didn't matter. I knew that even if I could reach someone, they wouldn't understand. They wouldn't believe me. I didn't fully believe it myself, not yet. But the house did. The house knew I was afraid. The bruises on my ankle throbbed. I lifted my pant leg and traced the outline of the darkened skin. The marks weren't just bruises. They were fingerprints, deep and undeniable. Something had grabbed me, something real. And that meant everything else was real, too. The whispers, the shadows, the presence pressing in on me like a weight I couldn't shake. Sitting there in the silence, I made a decision. If the house wouldn't let me leave, then I would make it let me go. I had no plan, no strategy, just raw desperation. I forced myself up, grabbing my keys and shoving them into my pocket. I was going to get out of this house if it killed me. The moment I stepped out of my bedroom, the temperature dropped. The hallway stretched before me, impossibly long, the walls seeming to pulse as I moved. Every step felt heavier, as though I were wading through water. The whispers rose, becoming frantic, hissing warnings I couldn't understand. My breath came in ragged gasps as I reached the staircase. And then the lights went out. Darkness swallowed me whole. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. The silence that followed was worse than the whispers. It was thick, suffocating. Then, from somewhere deep within the house, a door creaked open. Slow, deliberate. A sound so soft, yet it echoed through the halls like a scream. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. The screen flickered to life, casting a weak glow around me. That was when I saw them. Figures, dozens of them, standing at the end of the hallway. Motionless, waiting. Their silhouettes were barely discernible against the darkness, but I could feel them watching me. I turned, forcing my feet to move, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. I had to get out. The stairs loomed ahead, but the moment I took my first step, something yanked me back. I hit the floor hard, pain exploding through my spine. Fingers, cold, impossibly strong, wrapped around my wrist, dragging me backward. I clawed at the floor, my nails splintering against the wood. My screams were swallowed by the darkness as the figures closed in, their whispers growing louder, deafening. I don't know how I broke free. Maybe it let me go. Maybe it was playing with me. But suddenly I was running, stumbling down the stairs, my body moving on instinct alone. I didn't stop. Not when I reached the front door, not when I threw myself against it, twisting the handle with all the strength I had left. It didn't budge. I slammed my fist against the wood, tears streaming down my face. Let me out. My voice cracked, desperation seeping into every syllable. Please, just let me go. The house laughed. It was a low, guttural sound, echoing from the walls, the floors, the very air around me. The realization hit me like ice in my veins. I was never leaving. This house had no intention of letting me go. I turned, my back pressed against the door. The figures had followed me, standing at the edge of the room, their presence pressing in on me like a weight I couldn't escape. Then one of them stepped forward. It was different from the others. Taller, more defined. I could almost make out features. A mouth stretched into something that might have been a smile, hollow eyes that bored into mine with something like recognition. It raised a hand, beckoning. And I stepped forward. I don't know why. I should have fought. I should have screamed. But there was something about it, something that felt familiar. The whispers faded, replaced by a sound that sent ice through my veins. A voice. My voice. I've been waiting for you. The thing in front of me tilted its head, mimicking my movements. The moment stretched between us, taut and unbreakable. Then before I could react, it lunged. Bang. Cold. Darkness. And then, silence. When I woke, I wasn't in the house anymore. I was outside, standing in the front yard. The sky was gray, the air thick with the scent of damp earth. My hands were clean, my clothes unwrinkled, as if nothing had happened. But the house was different. The windows were dark, lifeless. The front door stood slightly ajar, swinging softly in the breeze. I turned, my pulse pounding in my ears. And that was when I saw it. My reflection. Not in a mirror, not in a window, but standing just a few feet away. It smiled. "Welcome home," it whispered. And then the door slammed shut behind me. I stumbled back, my breath hitching in my throat as I stared at the thing in front of me, my own reflection standing separate from me, grinning with a kind of knowing amusement that made my skin crawl. The wind howled around us, the house groaning like a living thing, but I barely heard it. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this thing as possible, but my legs wouldn't move. It wasn't just that I was frozen with fear. Something else held me there, something unseen, like invisible hands gripping my ankles. I wanted to turn away, to shut my eyes, to pretend this wasn't happening, but I couldn't. My reflection took a step forward, its smile widening, and I finally found my voice. What are you?" My voice came out barely above a whisper, weak and trembling. The thing that looked like me tilted its head, its movements too fluid, too unnatural, like a puppet with invisible strings. It didn't answer, not at first. Instead, it took another step closer, and with each step, the air around me seemed to thicken, pressing against my chest, making it harder to breathe. "I'm you," it finally said, and the voice, it was my voice, but not. It was hollow, distorted, like an echo in an empty room. "I've always been you." "No," I croaked, shaking my head. "No, you're not." The grin widened until it stretched unnaturally, almost splitting the skin. It stepped even closer, and I could see the details now, the way its skin seemed too smooth, too perfect, like it had been molded from something artificial. The eyes were the worst part, black pits that swallowed the light, empty but aware, watching me with a hunger I didn't understand. "You left me behind," it whispered, and something in its voice shifted. Resentment, accusation. "You tried to run, but you belong here." My heartbeat pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. I clenched my fists, trying to steady my breathing. I wasn't going to let this thing, whatever it was, control me. "I don't belong here," I said, forcing steel into my voice. "I'm leaving." The thing, my reflection, laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound, stretching on too long, like a record stuck on a loop. "Leave?" it echoed, shaking its head. "You don't understand, do you?" And then, before I could move, before I could react, it lunged at me. I stumbled back, but the moment it touched me, the world shattered. A searing pain exploded in my skull, and I wasn't outside anymore. I was back inside the house. The walls pulsed, the air thick with the scent of decay. The whispers returned, louder than before, but now they were screaming, an unholy chorus that made my bones tremble. I tried to move, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I looked down, and my hands weren't my hands anymore. They were pale. Too pale. I turned towards a mirror hanging on the wall. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't me. I was looking at the thing that had been outside, the thing that had my face but wasn't me. And now it was wearing me. "No," I gasped, stepping back, but the reflection mimicked me perfectly, its grin spreading wider and wider until it was a grotesque, nightmarish thing. "You wanted to leave," it whispered, but now the voice was coming from my mouth, from my stolen lips. "And now you have." I turned, my hands shaking, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My body felt wrong, unfamiliar, like I was trapped in something that wasn't mine. And then I saw it, the real me, standing in the middle of the room, staring at me with wide, horrified eyes. It wasn't just wearing my face, it was wearing me. It had taken my body, my voice, my everything. I tried to move forward, to reach out, to grab it, to force it out, but I couldn't. I was stuck. Trapped in something cold and formless, like a shadow without substance. The thing smiled at me. "Goodbye," it whispered, and then it turned and walked out the door. I screamed. I screamed and pounded on the walls, but nothing happened. The house absorbed the sound, swallowing my cries like they were never spoken. I ran to the door, tried to push through, but my hands passed right through it. I wasn't real anymore. I turned, my chest heaving, panic clawing at my throat. The house, it felt different now. It wasn't trying to keep me in, because I was part of it now. I was never getting out. I was the whisper in the walls. That first night inside the walls, I thought I would go insane. I had no body, no breath, no warmth. I was nothing but a whisper, a thought clinging desperately to the edges of a world that had already forgotten me. I screamed until my voice became one with the house's endless murmurs. I thrashed and clawed, but there was nothing to grasp, just an endless abyss of cold, suffocating darkness. I could still see, still hear, but it was all wrong. The house was no longer a house. It was a living, breathing thing. The walls pulsed as though something monstrous lay just beneath them, unseen but awake. The air reeked of dust and damp rot, thick and choking, pressing down on me like a weight I could never shake off. Time lost meaning. There were no days, no nights, just the endless, droning hum of whispers layered over one another, countless voices overlapping in a cacophony of agony and despair. They weren't just echoes, they were the others, the ones who came before me, the ones who had been swallowed whole. And then there was him, my body, my stolen self. I watched as he lived my life, moving with a strange fluidity, as if he had always been in my skin. He walked through my house, looked at my belongings with a quiet curiosity, touching everything like a child discovering the world for the first time. He picked up my phone, stared at it for a long moment, then laughed, a sharp, dry sound that sent shivers through me. Then he smashed it against the wall, the glass shattering into countless tiny fragments. I felt each crack like a splintering inside me, as if his destruction of my things was a direct wound to whatever was left of me. I wanted to rip him out, to force myself back into the flesh he had stolen, but I couldn't. I was nothing. Just another whisper in the walls. I don't know how long I watched him, trapped and helpless, as he unraveled my life thread by thread. He went through my things, took a long look in the mirror, stretched my stolen limbs with quiet fascination. He mimicked my voice, repeating my name over and over, twisting it into something foreign, something that no longer belonged to me. Then, slowly, he started to change things. He rearranged my furniture, threw away my clothes, destroyed every photograph of me. It was like he was erasing me, piece by piece, making sure there was no trace left behind. And then he began to let people in. At first, I thought maybe someone would notice. Maybe my friends, my family, someone would look into his eyes and see the wrongness, the soulless hunger lurking just beneath the surface. But no one did. They laughed with him, spoke to him, hugged him. No one questioned why he seemed different, why his voice held an unnatural lilt, why his eyes, my eyes, seemed so dark and empty. He was better than me. More charismatic, more confident. He knew things about people, things I had never known. He could read them, charm them, manipulate them with ease. I watched as he slipped into my life so effortlessly that it was like I had never existed at all. The worst part was the way he looked at them, the way he fed off them. I don't know how to explain it, but he wasn't human. Not entirely. He wasn't just stealing my life, he was consuming it. I could feel it, the way he drained the people around him, how he left them weaker, emptier, without them even realizing it. He was feeding off their energy, their warmth, growing stronger with each passing day. And me? I was fading. The longer I stayed trapped inside the walls, the more I became part of the house itself. I could hear the house breathing, could feel it shifting around me, could sense the other whispers growing weaker, dissolving into nothing. I didn't want to dissolve. I didn't want to become another forgotten voice in the endless hum of the house's hunger. I fought. I screamed. I pushed against the walls, tried to reach out, tried to grasp onto something, anything. And then one night I did. I don't know how it happened, but for the first time since I had been trapped, I touched something real. It was a small thing, barely even noticeable, but as I pushed against the walls, my hand, or whatever I had become, brushed against an old, dusty book on the shelf. The moment I felt it, the whispers around me shrieked in protest. The house didn't want me to touch anything. It wanted me to fade. It wanted me to be silent. But I wasn't going to be silent anymore. I pushed harder, concentrating with everything I had left. The book trembled, then fell from the shelf with a quiet thud. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The thing wearing my skin turned sharply, eyes narrowing as he stared at the fallen book. For the first time he looked uneasy. Good. I wasn't gone yet, and I wasn't going to let him win. I started slow. At first, it took all my strength just to nudge small objects. papers fluttering off tables, doors creaking slightly, a flicker in the lights. He noticed. I could see the way his expression shifted, the way his grip on my stolen life faltered just for a moment. He knew something was wrong. He just didn't know what. Then I grew stronger. I slammed doors, shattered mirrors, left messages in the dust. He tried to ignore it, but I could feel his unease growing. And then one night I spoke. It wasn't easy. I had no voice, no body, but I pushed, reached into something deep and raw inside me and whispered his name. My name. The sound was faint, barely more than a breath in the wind, but it was enough. He froze, his eyes darting wildly around the room. For the first time, I saw something I had never seen before. Fear. He could pretend all he wanted, but he wasn't me. He would never be me. And he knew it. I pushed harder. The whispers of the others joined me now, rising in a chaotic chorus. The house groaned and shuddered, the walls trembling as if something deep inside them was breaking free. He tried to fight it, tried to hold on to my stolen life, but I wasn't going to let him. Not this time. And then, something cracked. The world tilted. The house shuddered with a violent, deafening roar. I felt myself being pulled, ripped, dragged from the walls and back into something solid, something real. My body. I gasped, my lungs burning as if I had been drowning and had finally surfaced for air. The room spun, my limbs weak and trembling. I looked up. My reflection stood across from me. But this time it wasn't grinning. It was screaming. It clutched its throat, its body convulsing as it began to distort, its stolen skin cracking like shattered glass. And then, it was gone. I stumbled forward, my breath ragged, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. The house was silent. The whispers were gone. I was me again. But as I looked around at the ruined room, at the shattered mirror, at the eerie stillness that settled over everything, I knew. The house was still watching. And it was still hungry. The silence after it was gone was unbearable. Not the comforting kind of silence that wraps around you like a soft blanket, but the kind that creeps into your bones and makes you feel like something is still lurking just out of sight. I stood there, my breath ragged, my legs trembling beneath me, staring at my reflection in the shattered mirror. I was back. I was in my body again. But something felt wrong. The house was still breathing. It wasn't as loud as before, not the relentless murmurs or the suffocating pressure of 1,000 whispers gnawing at the edges of my mind, but I could still feel it. A slow, rhythmic pulse, almost like a heartbeat, buried deep within the walls. The kind of thing you could only notice if you were really listening. And I was listening. I forced myself to move, staggering toward the door. My body felt foreign, like I had been gone for too long, like it wasn't entirely mine anymore. My fingers fumbled against the doorknob, slick with sweat, before I managed to turn it. The door creaked open, revealing the hallway bathed in dim, flickering light. Everything looked the same, my home, my walls, my floor, but I knew better now. This wasn't my home. Not really. Not anymore. As I stepped into the hallway, my footfalls felt heavier than they should have, like the floor was swallowing them whole, absorbing the sound before it could escape. I walked slowly, deliberately, glancing at the pictures lining the walls. But they weren't the same. The frames were still there, the glass unbroken, but the images inside had changed. They were still pictures of me, at least they should have been. But the faces looking back at me were wrong. Their eyes were hollow, dark pits that stretched too wide, their mouths curled in twisted grins that didn't belong to me. I felt bile rise in my throat as I reached out, hesitantly brushing my fingers against the surface of one of the frames. The moment I touched it, the glass cracked, a jagged fissure running straight down the center of the grotesque smile. I yanked my hand back. The whispering started again. Soft at first, just a low murmur skittering along the edges of my consciousness, but it grew. Louder. Closer. The walls pulsed with it like the house itself was whispering directly into my ears. It didn't want me to leave. I took a step back, my pulse hammering in my chest. No, I wasn't going to let it take me again. I wasn't going to be trapped here, not when I had fought so hard to reclaim myself. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the floorboards, the walls narrowing around me as I reached the staircase. The stairs stretched downward like a gaping maw, endless and yawning, twisting in ways that made no sense. I didn't care. I had to get out. I bolted down, skipping steps, my breath coming in frantic gasps as the whispering rose to a deafening roar. The walls trembled, the pictures falling to the floor with sharp, splintering crashes. And then the front door was in sight. I sprinted toward it, my fingers already reaching for the handle when I saw it. The reflection in the glass. It wasn't mine. It was him. The thing that had worn my skin. His grin was stretched impossibly wide, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, his blackened eyes locked onto mine. And then he moved. Not in the reflection. Behind me. Cold breath slithered against the back of my neck, and I felt the weight of his presence pressing down on me like an anchor dragging me into the abyss. My muscles locked up, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't. You didn't think it would be that easy, did you? The voice wasn't just in my ears, it was inside me, curling around my thoughts, digging into my mind like sharp, rusted hooks. I clenched my jaw, forced myself to move, to push forward. My fingers fumbled against the lock, my hands trembling as I twisted the knob, yanking the door open with all my strength. Cold air slammed against me like a tidal wave, and I stumbled forward, barely managing to keep my balance as I stumbled onto the porch. The moment my feet hit the ground outside, the world shifted. The whispering stopped. The air was still. The oppressive weight that had been crushing me disappeared. I gasped, sucking in deep lungfuls of crisp night air, my knees nearly buckling beneath me. I was out. I turned, expecting to see the house looming behind me, expecting to see the thing wearing my face watching from the doorway. But there was nothing. No house. Just an empty lot. I stared, my breath hitching in my throat. The place where my house had stood was nothing but a patch of barren earth, as if it had never existed. No ruins. No foundation. Just nothing. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. This wasn't possible. I had just been inside. A low chuckle rumbled behind me. I turned sharply, but there was no one there. No one except my own shadow stretching across the ground, longer than it should have been, its edges twisting and writhing like it was alive. I backed away, my pulse hammering in my skull. No, I was out. I was free. The shadow moved. Not with me. On its own. And then, ever so slowly, it smiled. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, staring at the thing that should not have been. The night stretched around me, impossibly vast, the silence pressing down like a weight I couldn't escape. My shadow should have been just that, a shadow. A simple, mindless shape cast by the dim glow of the streetlight. But it wasn't. It was watching me. It was waiting. I forced myself to move, to step away, but the shadow didn't follow. It stayed, lingering behind as though it no longer belonged to me. The moment I stepped fully out of the streetlight's glow, it vanished, dissolving into the darkness as if it had never existed. But I knew better. It was still there, waiting, watching. And I knew, with a certainty that made my blood run cold, that it wasn't over. I had left the house, but I had not escaped it, because the house was never just a house. It was something else, something alive, something that had been waiting for me for a very long time. And now it was inside me. I could feel it, a whisper in the back of my mind, a shadow that did not move with me, a smile lingering in the darkness. And as I turned away, walking into the night with no home, no past, no proof that I had ever existed at all, I knew it was only a matter of time, before it took me again, before it wore me again, before the next door opened, and another lost soul stepped inside. Story 5. The house was too quiet. That was the first thing I noticed when I moved in. It wasn't the kind of quiet that felt peaceful or serene. It was the kind that pressed against your eardrums, heavy and suffocating, like the air before a storm. I told myself it was just because the place was empty, that once I unpacked my things and settled in, it would feel more like home. But even as I filled the rooms with furniture and stacked boxes in the corners, the silence lingered, thick and unyielding. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. The first night I barely slept. The wind outside rattled the windows, and every creak of the floorboards made my heart race. I told myself it was just the old house settling the way old houses do. But then I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like someone whispering just loud enough to be heard but not loud enough to be understood. I sat up in bed, straining my ears, but the sound was gone as quickly as it had come. I lay back down, my pulse pounding in my ears, and told myself it was nothing. Just my imagination. Just the wind. But it wasn't the wind. The next night it happened again. This time the sound was clearer, closer. It wasn't a whisper anymore, it was a voice. Soft and low, almost melodic, but with an edge to it that made my skin crawl. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel them, like cold fingers brushing against the back of my neck. I pulled the blankets up to my chin and squeezed my eyes shut, willing the sound to go away. But it didn't. It grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like it was coming from inside my head. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The voice was everywhere, filling the room, filling me. I don't know how long I lay there, trembling and paralyzed, before it finally stopped. When it did, the silence was worse. It felt like the house was holding its breath again, waiting for me to move, to scream, to do something. I didn't sleep at all that night. By the third night, I was exhausted. My eyes felt gritty, and my head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that there was nothing in the house, nothing to be afraid of. But as I climbed into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of my own breathing. And then I heard it again, the voice. This time it wasn't just a sound. It was a word. My name. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The voice was coming from the corner of the room, where the shadows were deepest. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. A presence, something watching me, waiting for me to respond. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but I couldn't move. I was trapped, pinned to the bed by some invisible force. The voice came again, louder this time, more urgent. It wasn't just saying my name anymore. It was calling me. I don't know how I found the strength to move, but somehow I did. I threw off the blankets and bolted out of bed, stumbling toward the door. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the knob, but I managed to wrench it open and stumble into the hallway. The house was dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the windows. I ran down the stairs, my bare feet slapping against the wooden steps, and didn't stop until I was in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, gasping for breath. My heart was still racing and my skin was slick with sweat, but the voice was gone. The house was silent again. I spent the rest of the night on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the shadows on the walls. I told myself it was just a nightmare, that I had been half asleep and imagined the whole thing. But deep down I knew better. The voice had been real. And it wasn't going to stop. The next morning I tried to convince myself that everything was fine. I made coffee, unpacked a few more boxes, and even opened the windows to let in some fresh air. But the house still felt wrong, like it was watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. I thought about calling someone, a friend, a family member, anyone, but I didn't know what I would say. Hey, I think my new house is haunted? They'd think I was crazy. Maybe I was. As the day wore on, I started to feel better. The sunlight streaming through the windows made the house feel less oppressive, and the voice seemed like a distant memory. By the time night fell, I had almost convinced myself that it had all been in my head. Almost. I went to bed early, determined to get a good night's sleep. But as soon as I turned off the light, the fear came rushing back. I lay there in the dark, my ears straining for any sound, my body tense and ready to bolt. For a long time there was nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing and the occasional creak of the house settling. And then I heard it. The voice. It was softer this time, almost gentle, but it sent a chill down my spine all the same. It wasn't coming from the corner of the room anymore. It was coming from right beside me, so close I could feel the breath on my ear. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. The voice whispered my name again, and this time I could feel it, cold, bony fingers brushing against my arm, trailing up to my shoulder. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for it to stop, for it to go away. But it didn't. The fingers tightened their grip, and the voice grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't just saying my name anymore. It was telling me something. Something I didn't want to hear. I don't know how long it went on. It felt like hours, but it could have been minutes or even seconds. All I know is that when it finally stopped, I was alone again. The room was silent, the shadows still. But I knew it wasn't over. The voice would be back. And next time it might not let me go. I didn't sleep that night. Or the night after. I spent my days in a fog, jumping at every sound, every shadow. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, nothing to be afraid of. But I knew better. The voice was real. And it wasn't going to stop. Not until it got what it wanted. And then one night it changed. The voice wasn't just calling my name anymore. It was telling me to do something. Something I didn't want to do. Something I couldn't do. But the voice was insistent, relentless. It filled my head, drowning out everything else until it was all I could hear, all I could think about. I tried to resist, to fight it, but it was too strong. It was like a force pulling me, guiding me until I was standing in front of the mirror in the hallway, staring at my own reflection. The voice told me to look closer, to really look, and I did. I leaned in, my face inches from the glass, and that's when I saw it. Something in the reflection that wasn't me. Something dark and twisted, lurking just behind my shoulder. I wanted to turn around to see what it was, but I couldn't move. The voice was in control now, and it wasn't going to let me go. Not until I did what it wanted. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the mirror, watching as the thing behind me grew closer, more defined. But I know that when it finally reached out, when its cold, bony fingers wrapped around my throat, I didn't fight it. I couldn't. The voice had won. And then, just like that, it was over. The voice was gone, the house was silent, and I was alone again. But I knew it wasn't really over. The voice would be back. And next time, I might not be so lucky. I don't sleep much anymore. I can't. Every time I close my eyes, I hear it, the voice calling my name, telling me to do things I don't want to do. And I know that one day I won't be able to resist. One day the voice will win. And when it does, I don't know what will happen to me. But I do know one thing. I won't be alone anymore. The days blurred together after that night in front of the mirror. Time lost its meaning, and the line between reality and whatever nightmare I was trapped in grew thinner with each passing hour. I stopped eating properly, surviving on coffee and whatever snacks I could grab from the kitchen. My reflection in the mirror became a stranger, pale, hollow-eyed, and haunted. I avoided looking at it as much as I could, but sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I'd catch a glimpse of something moving behind me. Something that wasn't there when I turned around. The voice didn't come every night, but when it did, it was worse than before. It wasn't just whispering my name anymore. It was speaking in full sentences, telling me things I didn't want to know. Things about the house, about the people who had lived here before me, about the things that had happened within these walls. I tried to block it out, to cover my ears and hum to myself, but it didn't work. The voice wasn't coming from outside me, it was inside my head, echoing in the darkest corners of my mind. One night it told me a story about a family who had lived here decades ago. A mother, a father, and a little girl. They had been happy at first, the voice said, but then something changed. The father started hearing things, seeing things. He became paranoid, convinced that someone, or something, was watching him. He locked the doors and windows, drew the curtains, and refused to let his wife and daughter leave the house. The mother tried to reason with him, but he wouldn't listen. He said the house was protecting them, that it was keeping them safe from the outside world. But the voice told me the truth. The house wasn't protecting them. It was feeding on them. The story didn't end well. The father went mad, the mother disappeared, and the little girl was left alone in the house, waiting for someone to come and save her. But no one ever did. The voice didn't tell me what happened to her, but I could guess. I didn't want to know the details. I didn't want to think about the little girl, alone in the dark, waiting for a rescue that never came. But the voice wouldn't let me forget. It kept bringing her up, whispering her name in my ear, telling me to look for her. I didn't want to. I didn't want to know what had happened to her, or what she had become. But the voice was relentless. It wouldn't stop until I did what it wanted. And so, one night I gave in. I didn't have a choice. The voice was too strong, too persistent. It had worn me down, broken me. I was too tired to fight anymore. I started in the attic. It was the one place in the house I hadn't explored yet, and I had a feeling that was where I would find her. The little girl. The stairs creaked as I climbed them, and the air grew colder with each step. By the time I reached the top, my breath was coming out in white puffs and my fingers were numb. The attic was dark, the only light coming from the flashlight I clutched in my trembling hand. The beam of light danced across the walls, revealing stacks of boxes, old furniture, and cobwebs that hung like curtains from the ceiling. I didn't want to be there. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn around, to go back downstairs, to lock the door and never come back. But I couldn't. The voice wouldn't let me. It guided me deeper into the attic, toward a corner that was darker than the rest. The air there was so cold it burned my lungs, and the floorboards groaned under my weight. I shone the flashlight into the corner, and that's when I saw it. A doll. It was old, its porcelain face cracked and stained, its dress tattered and faded. Its glassy eyes stared up at me, and for a moment, I could have sworn they moved. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest, but the voice urged me forward. It told me to pick up the doll, to hold it in my arms. I didn't want to. I didn't want to touch it, but I couldn't resist. My hands moved on their own, reaching out and lifting the doll from the floor. It was heavier than I expected, and cold, so cold it felt like it was sucking the warmth from my body. The voice told me to take it downstairs, to put it in the little girl's room. I didn't know what it meant. There was no little girl's room in the house. But as I carried the doll down the stairs, I realized I was wrong. There was a room I hadn't noticed before, tucked away at the end of the hallway. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint light spilled out from the crack. I pushed it open with my foot and stepped inside. The room was small, with pink walls and a white crib in the corner. A mobile hung above the crib, its pastel-colored shapes swaying gently in the breeze from the open window. The floor was covered in toys, and a rocking chair sat in the corner, its seat worn from years of use. It looked like a child's room, but it felt wrong. The air was too still, too heavy, and the light from the window was too bright, too artificial. It didn't feel real. The voice told me to put the doll in the crib. I didn't want to. I didn't want to go anywhere near that crib. But I didn't have a choice. My legs carried me across the room, and my arms lifted the doll, placing it gently on the mattress. As soon as I let go, the room changed. The light dimmed, the air grew colder, and the toys on the floor began to move. They didn't just shift or rattle. They moved with purpose, crawling toward the crib like insects. I backed away, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps, but the voice told me to stay. It told me to watch. The toys climbed up the sides of the crib and disappeared inside. I couldn't see what they were doing, but I could hear it, the sound of tiny hands moving, of fabric tearing, of something being stitched together. And then, slowly, the doll began to move. Its head turned, its arms lifted, and its glassy eyes fixed on me. It smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched across its cracked porcelain face. And then it spoke. "Thank you," it said, its voice high-pitched and childlike. "I've been waiting for you." I don't remember how I got out of the room. One moment I was standing there, staring at the doll, and the next I was running down the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I was back in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, gasping for breath. The house was silent again, but I knew it wasn't over. The doll was still there waiting for me. And the voice was still in my head, whispering, urging, demanding. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the doll's face, its cracked porcelain smile, its glassy eyes staring into mine. I heard its voice, high-pitched and childlike, thanking me for bringing it back. I didn't know what I had done, but I knew it was bad. I had awakened something that had been sleeping for a long time. And now it was awake, and it wasn't going to let me go. The next few days were a blur. I tried to leave the house, to get away from whatever was happening, but every time I reached for the door, the voice stopped me. It told me I couldn't leave, that I had to stay, that I had a job to do. I didn't know what it meant, but I was too afraid to disobey. So I stayed, wandering the house like a ghost, avoiding the little girl's room in the attic as much as I could. But the voice wouldn't let me forget. It kept reminding me, whispering in my ear, telling me to go back, to finish what I had started. And then one night I did. I don't know why I went back to the attic. Maybe I was curious, maybe I was desperate, or maybe the voice had finally worn me down, broken me completely. Whatever the reason, I found myself climbing the stairs again, the flashlight in my hand, the cold air biting at my skin. The attic was just as I had left it, dark and cluttered, with the doll sitting in the corner, its glassy eyes staring up at me. The voice told me to pick it up again, to take it back to the little girl's room. I didn't want to. I didn't want to touch it, to feel its cold, heavy weight in my arms. But I didn't have a choice. My hands moved on their own, lifting the doll from the floor and carrying it down the stairs. The little girl's room was waiting for me, the door slightly ajar, the faint light spilling out from the crack. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was different this time. The walls were darker, the toys were gone, and the crib was empty. The rocking chair in the corner was moving back and forth, even though no one was sitting in it. The voice told me to put the doll in the crib, so I did. As soon as I let go, the room changed again. The light dimmed, the air grew colder, and the rocking chair stopped moving. And then, slowly, the doll began to change. Its cracked porcelain face smoothed over, its tattered dress became whole, and its glassy eyes grew brighter, more lifelike. It looked like a real child now, a little girl with rosy cheeks and a sweet smile. But there was something wrong with her eyes. They were too dark, too empty, like two bottomless pits that sucked in all the light around them. She sat up in the crib, her head tilting to the side as she looked at me. "You're here," she said, her voice soft and sweet. "I've been waiting for you." I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do. I just stood there, frozen, as the little girl climbed out of the crib and walked toward me. She was so small, so fragile, but there was something about her that made my skin crawl. Something dark and twisted, something that didn't belong in this world. "Thank you," she said, reaching out to take my hand. Her fingers were cold, so cold they burned. "Now we can be together." I wanted to pull away, to run, to scream, but I couldn't. Her grip was too strong, her eyes too mesmerizing. I was trapped, caught in her web, and there was no way out. The voice in my head was gone now, replaced by her voice, soft and sweet and terrifying. "Don't be afraid," she said, smiling up at me. "We're going to have so much fun." And then she led me out of the room, down the hallway, and into the darkness. I didn't know where we were going, but I knew it didn't matter. There was no escape. Not anymore. The house was quiet again, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet as before. It was a waiting quiet, a watching quiet. And I knew deep down that it would never be quiet again. Not as long as I was here. Not as long as we were here. The days that followed were a blur. I moved through the house like a ghost, my body heavy and sluggish, my mind clouded with a fog that wouldn't lift. The little girl was always there, her presence a constant, oppressive weight, her voice whispering in my ear, urging me to do things I didn't want to do. I tried to resist, to fight back, but it was no use. The darkness was too strong, the house too powerful. I was trapped, caught in a web of fear and despair that I couldn't escape. The house itself seemed to change, the walls shifting and warping, the rooms growing larger and smaller, the air growing thicker and heavier. It was like the house was alive, a living, breathing entity that fed on my fear, my despair. And it was growing stronger with every passing day. The little girl's room was always there, waiting for me, the door slightly ajar, the faint light spilling out from the crack. I tried to avoid it, to stay as far away as possible, but it was no use. The little girl always found me, her small hand tugging me along, her dark eyes watching me with a kind of satisfaction that made my stomach churn. And then one night she led me back to the basement. The circle was there again, the symbols glowing faintly in the darkness. The little girl stepped into the circle and turned to look at me, her dark eyes gleaming with something that might have been excitement. "It's time," she said, her voice soft and sweet, but with an edge to it that made my stomach churn. "It's time to finish what we started." I never should have taken that road. It was late, the sky a hollow black, the stars swallowed by thick, unrelenting clouds. My GPS had died hours ago, and the highway signs had become sparse, their lettering faded beyond recognition. The only thing keeping me company was the steady hum of my engine and the occasional rustle of wind through the skeletal trees lining the narrow road. I told myself it was just a detour, a shortcut to save time, but deep down I knew better. There was something wrong about this place. The trees pressed closer, their branches gnarled and reaching like fingers eager to clutch at my car. My headlights barely pierced the darkness, revealing only twisted roots and the occasional glint of something wet on the pavement. The road narrowed further, forcing me to slow down. My knuckles were white against the steering wheel, my breath shallow. I wasn't sure when the silence had grown so absolute. No crickets, no wind, just the sound of my own breathing and the distant ticking of the engine. Then I saw it, a shape in the distance, standing in the middle of the road. At first I thought it was a deer, but as I got closer, the silhouette sharpened into something human. A woman. She stood motionless, her head tilted slightly, watching me. My foot hesitated over the brake, my instinct screaming at me to turn around, but there was nowhere to go. The road was too narrow and the forest too dense. I had no choice but to stop. As my car rolled to a halt, my headlights flooded her with light. She was barefoot, her dress a tattered, grayish-white, clinging to her thin frame. Her arms hung limply at her sides, her hair tangled and damp. Her face was obscured, hidden beneath a curtain of matted strands. I swallowed hard, my heart hammering against my ribs. I reached for the lock button, though I couldn't explain why. She hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. Just stood there as if waiting. I cracked my window just enough to call out, "Hey, are you okay?" My voice sounded strange, too loud in the oppressive silence. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she took a single step forward. The way she moved sent a shiver through me. It was slow, deliberate, almost unnatural. I resisted the urge to throw the car into reverse and slam my foot on the gas. She took another step, her bare feet silent on the pavement. Then, in a motion too quick for my eyes to follow, she was suddenly right next to my window. I jerked back with a gasp, my hand fumbling to roll up the window. She was close enough now that I could see her face through the gap. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, her lips cracked and dry. But it was her eyes that froze me in place. They were wrong. Too large, too black, voids where light was swallowed whole. A scream clawed its way up my throat, but my voice failed me. She raised a hand, placing her fingers lightly against the glass. They were ice cold even through the barrier. Then she smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. It stretched too far, her lips splitting at the corners as though something beneath her skin was forcing them apart. My breath came in sharp gasps as I fumbled to shift the car into gear. Her fingers dragged along the window, leaving behind smudges of something dark. What? I didn't wait to find out. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, the tires screeching against the pavement. The car lurched forward, but as I sped past, my side